June 12, 1941. The Western Desert, 20 miles west of Tobruk. The sun beat down on the sand like fire. British Crusader tanks sat motionless, their crews sweating in silence. Overhead, the faint growl of German bombers rolled through the heat. Then, nothing. The planes passed, searching. They never saw the line of tanks below. To the untrained eye, the armoured column was gone, swallowed by the desert itself. At the centre of it all stood a man with a paintbrush and a grin. Major Solomon Lang, the man whose stupid paint job had just fooled the Luftwaffe. Lang lowered his binoculars and exhaled. The sound of the bombers faded into the shimmer of the horizon, leaving only the whisper of wind brushing the dunes. Around him, tank crews began emerging from their steel ovens, blinking against the glare. Someone muttered a prayer of disbelief. A Crusader commander climbed out of his turret, helmet crooked on his head. "Major Lang," he called, half grinning, half stunned. "They flew right over us." Lang simply nodded. "That's the point, Captain." They can't bomb what they can't see. For weeks he'd been laughed out of meetings in Cairo, his proposal dismissed as the delusion of an artist who didn't understand war. Paint? Against the Luftwaffe? They wanted thicker armour, not colour theory. But now, out here in the furnace of Cyrenaica, his brushstrokes had done what steel and sandbags could not. The tanks before him didn't look painted, they looked wrong. Angular blotches of pale sand, false shadows drawn in charcoal, uneven streaks that broke every line of symmetry. Up close, the scheme looked chaotic, almost childish. But from above, under the merciless glare of the midday sun, they blended into the desert floor perfectly, the shapes of machines dissolving into mirage. Lang scribbled in his notebook, recording the bomber altitude, the direction of approach, and the hour's light intensity. Every observation mattered. To him, camouflage wasn't art, it was mathematics of perception. The officers behind him watched in silence, the skepticism gone from their eyes. Lieutenant Colonel Havers, who had called Lang's work a waste of army paint, adjusted his cap and muttered, "I'll be damned." Lang turned toward him. "Permission to call it science, sir?" Havers didn't answer. He just stared across the horizon, where the bombers disappeared toward Tobruk, their prey unseen. That afternoon, when the tanks rumbled back toward their encampment, Lang rode atop a Bedford lorry, sketchbook balanced on his knee. The men were quiet, half superstitious, as if speaking might break whatever magic cloaked their machines. He thought back to how this all began. A letter to the War Office months ago, ignored. Then a chance meeting in London with Brigadier Stevens, head of the newly formed Camouflage Development and Training Centre. Stevens had read Lang's earlier paper on countershading, the principle used by animals like antelope and sharks, whose lighter bellies cancelled the sun's shadow. Lang had spent years studying it at the Royal College of Art before the war interrupted everything. Now, at last, theory had turned to proof. When they reached camp, the men parked the Crusaders in rows beside their unpainted counterparts, a perfect comparison for the next morning's aerial observation test. Lang paced between them like a curator preparing an exhibition, making notes on tone balance and reflection angles. That night, the desert turned cold, the sky clear and merciless. Lang sat beside a hurricane lamp, painting small wooden models for the next phase, experiments with disrupted silhouettes under moonlight. The glow lit his hands, stained in ochre, grey and white. Around him, the tank crews played cards and swapped cigarettes, their laughter a brief refuge from war. One corporal wandered over, curiosity overcoming fatigue. "Sir," he said quietly, "how do you even think of all this?" Lang looked up. "I watched a lizard disappear," he replied. "Years ago, in the Sinai. It didn't move fast. It just matched the light. I realized then, invisibility isn't about colour. It's about confusing the brain." The corporal nodded slowly, half understanding, then grinned. Well, you sure confused Jerry today. Lang smiled, but his thoughts were already miles away. Tomorrow's test, new pigment ratios, and how to convince command to adopt the pattern before the next offensive. Dawn broke cold and violet. By mid-morning, a reconnaissance Blenheim circled above the camp, cameras clicking. The photos would be compared that evening. Lang waited near the signal tent as the courier brought the prints fresh from the portable darkroom. Silver-grey rectangles, still damp at the edges. The first image showed the unpainted tanks, dark silhouettes, crisp outlines, shadows sharp as knives. The second photo showed his painted line. Lang's pulse quickened. At first glance, nothing. Just desert, tyre tracks, maybe some rocks. Then he saw them. Faint distortions, barely perceptible. The tanks were there, but invisible unless you knew where to look. When the officers gathered around the table, no one spoke. Finally, Brigadier Stevens, newly arrived from Cairo, leaned in, pipe in hand. "You've changed the way we hide," he said quietly, "and possibly the way we fight." Lang closed his notebook, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. For the first time, the laughter that had followed him through months of mockery was gone. He knew what came next. More tests, field deployment, endless bureaucracy. But today, under the relentless African sun, Major Solomon Lang had done something extraordinary. He had made the impossible disappear. For days after the Tobruk test, word spread across the 8th Army camps like desert wildfire. Soldiers who'd never met Major Solomon Lang now spoke his name over mess tins and radio chatter. That painter who fooled the Luftwaffe. Some swore the story was exaggerated, others that it was pure sorcery. But in Cairo, senior officers began to take notice. A telegram summoned Lang back from the front. It was stamped urgent, GHQ Middle East Command. He boarded a dusty Dakota transport the next morning, sitting between crates of engine parts and two silent officers who avoided his eyes. Outside the window, the desert stretched endless and gold, the same backdrop that had swallowed his tanks whole. He replayed the test in his mind, the shimmer of heat, the nervous glances from the tank crews, the sound of Stuka engines fading into nothing. Proof of concept. But to convince the brass, proof wasn't enough. They wanted procedure, reproducibility, doctrine. At Cairo, the War Office compound buzzed with heat and hierarchy. Lang, still wearing his faded desert khakis and paint-stained boots, looked wildly out of place among the polished floors and crisp uniforms. Waiting outside the operations room, he heard an officer murmur, "That's the art fellow, isn't it? The one with the funny tanks." He pretended not to hear. Inside, Brigadier Stevens sat at the head of a long mahogany table, flanked by intelligence officers and technical staff. The air smelled of tobacco and dust. "Major Lang," Stevens began, "your field test at Tobruk was, by all accounts, remarkable." Lang nodded cautiously. "Thank you, sir." "Remarkable enough," the brigadier continued, "that London wants full documentation. They're calling it disruptive pattern painting. You'll assist our photographic interpreters to formalize the scheme." Lang blinked. "You mean they're adopting it?" Stevens smiled faintly. "For once, yes. And this time, they're calling it brilliant, not stupid." That night, Lang worked under the yellow glow of a desk lamp in a converted storeroom. Maps and photographs were spread before him. Aerial shots, light-angle charts, pigment samples labelled with handwritten notes. Sun at 48 degrees. Sand, reflectivity high. Use ochre over stone grey. He moved like a man possessed, mixing paint ratios in small tins, sketching patterns inspired by the landscape itself. Dunes, rock strata, mirage distortions. He remembered his early days at the Royal College of Art in the 1930s, studying how light distorted form. Back then, he'd painted landscapes and studied the camouflage of animals, leopards, snakes, birds of prey. He'd been fascinated by how nature used contrast, not uniformity, to disappear. When the war began, he'd volunteered as an engineer, but his talents were too odd for the workshops. Eventually, someone in Whitehall read his academic paper titled Countershading in Industrial and Natural Contexts and reassigned him to the camouflage section, a department the soldiers nicknamed the Dazzlers. In those early days, Lang's proposals had been mocked outright. He once suggested that British tanks in North Africa should not be a single flat colour, but a chaotic blend of pale tones and false shadows. The reaction was immediate. A senior officer had laughed, saying, "So you want to turn His Majesty's tanks into circus wagons?" Lang had replied simply, "Better a circus wagon unseen than a coffin seen." That line followed him for months. But now, sitting in Cairo with piles of evidence and photographs, he felt the tide turning. He wasn't alone anymore. A small team of painters, engineers, and photographers joined him. The Camouflage Development and Training Centre, relocated from England to Egypt to study desert conditions. Among them was a young corporal named Arthur Pip Wilkes, a former sign painter from Manchester with a sharp wit and a steady hand. Pip became Lang's assistant and unofficial translator between artist and army. "Sir," Pip said one morning, examining a freshly painted Crusader hull, "if my mum saw me painting this, she'd think I'd lost it." Lang smiled. "If your mum saw it from the air, she'd never know it was there." By July, they were conducting large-scale trials, entire platoons of tanks and trucks painted under Lang's direction. The results stunned observers. German reconnaissance aircraft reported incomplete enemy positions or possible mirage formations. British armour was disappearing into its surroundings like ghosts. Yet still, not everyone was convinced. Some field commanders complained that the irregular patterns made maintenance difficult, or that soldiers didn't want to drive something that looked unfinished. Lang ignored them. He was already designing new templates, modular paint kits that could be applied quickly across divisions. His obsession grew deeper. He studied not just paint, but how light behaved on metal under desert sun. He tested matte coatings to reduce glare, experimented with crushed chalk to dull reflectivity, and even examined how early morning shadows could be faked with darker paint along hull edges. To most, it was madness. To Lang, it was the science of survival. In early August, General Auchinleck himself visited the testing ground. The commander of the 8th Army stood beside Lang, squinting against the glare as two tank columns manoeuvred across the flats, one painted conventionally, the other in Lang's disruptive scheme. The general raised his field glasses. "I can see the first group clear as day. The second—" He paused. "They vanish every time the light shifts." Lang said nothing. The proof spoke for itself. By month's end, official orders were issued. All operational tanks in the Western Desert were to adopt the Lang pattern, designated Desert Disruptive Type A. Supply depots scrambled to produce enough pigment. Workshops from Alexandria to Tobruk worked day and night, repainting vehicles before the next offensive. For the first time, the desert belonged not just to those who fought hardest, but to those who could disappear fastest. That evening, Lang stood alone on the airfield edge, watching the sunset melt into crimson over the dunes. The hum of distant engines echoed faintly across the sand. He knew battles were coming, bigger, bloodier, inevitable. But now at least his men would fight unseen. He thought of all the laughter, the scorn, the word stupid hurled at him for months. He almost smiled. In war, stupidity sometimes saved lives. October 23rd, 1942. El Alamein, Egypt. The desert was alive with silence, that terrible waiting kind of silence that sits before the storm. Along the British lines, hundreds of tanks crouched in the dunes under a moonless sky. Mechanics whispered over tools, gunners adjusted their sights, and officers moved like ghosts between machines. Somewhere to the north, the faint rumble of artillery checked its breath. Major Solomon Lang stood beside a Crusader tank marked Desert Disruptive, Type A. His paint job, the one that had been mocked as stupid, now covered an entire army. The strange, chaotic patterns stretched as far as the horizon, millions of gallons of pigment, carefully mixed and sprayed to confuse the eye and the camera alike. Tomorrow night, the 8th Army would strike, Montgomery's great offensive against Rommel's Afrika Korps. And tonight, thanks to Lang's patterns, the enemy would see nothing coming. At dusk, German reconnaissance planes droned overhead. Their cameras captured the same desert stretches they'd flown over for weeks: ridges, dunes, empty flats. The photos would reach Rommel's intelligence staff within hours. Nothing unusual, no sudden massing of armour, just sand. But hidden among those dunes, under tarps painted with Lang's shadow breaker technique, lay more than 900 tanks and 2,000 guns, an entire mechanized fist, invisible beneath the sun's fading light. Lang crouched beside Pip Wilkes near a tank's hull, studying the edges of a shadow. Pip wiped sweat from his brow, streaking dust across his cheek. "Sir," he whispered, "if this works, the Germans'll think the desert itself turned against them." Lang didn't look up. "They already do." He touched the paint, rough sand-grain texture. The formula included crushed limestone and a trace of graphite, designed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. From above, under moonlight or midday sun, it broke every familiar outline. Even the shadows were false. It wasn't just paint anymore. It was deception perfected. That night, the bombardment began. The desert erupted in flame. Artillery lit the horizon like 1,000 thunderstorms breaking at once. Lang watched from a ridge as tracer fire stitched the dark, each streak reflected faintly off the dunes. The tanks began to roll, Matildas, Crusaders, Grants, all wearing his camouflage like a uniform of ghosts. From the air, German pilots scrambled to locate the source of the fire. Reports came in confused and contradictory. Enemy positions appear dispersed. No visible armour formations, possible decoy fire. Rommel's staff dismissed the first alerts as false. By dawn, they realised the truth, but too late. The British armour had already punched through the lines north of Kidney Ridge, their advance shielded not by armour or air cover, but by perception itself. When the smoke cleared, the desert bore strange scars. Burned-out tanks sat beside untouched ones, sometimes only meters apart. Lang arrived 2 days after the first assault to inspect the battlefield. The sun was brutal, the air thick with the metallic tang of oil and sand. He stopped beside a destroyed Panzer III, its gun twisted skyward. Nearby lay a Crusader, intact but scuffed, its disruptive pattern faded by blast dust. The tank's crew sat in the shade of its hull, sipping tepid water. They looked up as Lang approached. "You the paint bloke?" one asked, squinting. Lang nodded. "Then cheers to you, sir." Jerry couldn't hit what he couldn't bloody see. Lang smiled faintly and walked on. He didn't need medals or speeches. The proof was here, in steel and silence. In the days that followed, the desert turned into a gallery of his work, wreckage and triumph, all painted in the same irregular patchwork. Intelligence officers later reviewed German aerial footage from before the battle. In frame after frame they saw dunes, rock and mirage, but not tanks. The enemy had missed hundreds of vehicles hidden in plain sight. Lang's camouflage had changed the course of the campaign. The 8th Army's advance through North Africa was no longer a blind push across open ground. It was a ghost march. Back in Cairo, newspapers printed victory headlines, though few mentioned the man behind the deception. His name appeared only in marginal reports, buried under columns of statistics and strategy. He didn't mind. That was, in a way, the highest compliment a camouflage officer could receive, to remain unseen. But Lang wasn't finished. After El Alamein, he proposed an even bolder idea: mobile camouflage units capable of painting and repainting entire formations overnight, adapting schemes to shifting terrain. Headquarters thought him obsessed. "We've won," they said. "No need for theatrics now." He disagreed. Victory bred complacency, and complacency killed men. By early 1943, as the Allies pushed into Tunisia, Lang refined his formula for new environments: olive drab mixed with red earth pigments, darker false shadows under hulls. He collaborated with engineers on anti-glare coatings and experimented with netting dyed to mimic scrub and stone. Soldiers began calling his techniques Lang's ghost work. And yet, even as his influence spread, Lang himself began to fade. Another figure lost to the bureaucracy of war. Promotions bypassed him. Younger officers took credit for his methods. His only consolation came in the field reports: reconnaissance failures, missed targets, ambushed columns. Every misstep of the enemy was proof that his stupid paint job still worked. One night, at a forward base near Gabes, Lang and Pip sat outside a tent watching the desert stars. The air smelled of fuel and dust. "You ever think," Pip said quietly, "that the war'll forget us?" Lang chuckled. "That's the point, Pip. Camouflage only works if no one remembers who did it." They sat in silence for a long while, the wind whispering over the sand, two artists in a canvas of war, painting nothingness into survival. May 1943, Tunis, North Africa. The war in the desert was over. The last of the Afrika Korps surrendered beneath a sun that had once been their greatest ally. Columns of weary German prisoners trudged past rows of British armour, each tank streaked with the same chaotic patchwork that had once seemed absurd. To the enemy, they now looked like a secret they had never managed to decipher. Major Solomon Lang stood beside one of those tanks, a battered Valentine whose hull bore scars of shrapnel and heat, but whose pattern still held firm. He traced his fingers along the faded paintwork. What had begun as a joke in Cairo had become the visual language of victory. Pip Wilkes approached with a folder of reports. "More letters from England, sir," he said, handing them over. Lang opened the top one, an official directive from the War Office dated April 29th. Camouflage Scheme Desert Type A to be standardised across all Commonwealth forces. Recommendations to be extended to European operations under modified palette. Lang exhaled slowly. That was it, the formal recognition. His once stupid idea had become regulation. After months in the desert, he returned to Britain a stranger. London in 1943 was grey, cold, and ration-thin. The city hummed with preparation for the coming invasion of Europe. Every street was a mosaic of khaki, factory soot, and blackout curtains. Lang reported to the Camouflage Development and Training Centre at Farnham Castle, the same institution where his career had begun. But it was no longer the small, eccentric band of artists and engineers he'd known. It had become a vast organisation, rows of draftsmen, paint chemists, and intelligence officers, all working to camouflage everything from tanks to entire airfields. He walked the halls quietly, unnoticed by most. On the walls hung diagrams of patterns that bore his fingerprints, though his name appeared nowhere. Disruptive Pattern Type B, Woodland Scheme, one chart read. Another showed mock-ups of D-Day landing craft, each painted in broken stripes of blue, grey and white, the seaborne evolution of his desert formula. Lang smiled faintly. The principal had survived the ocean. One afternoon, while reviewing field photographs from Tunisia, a young lieutenant approached him. "Major Lang, sir?" the man asked. "I read about your work in North Africa. Incredible stuff. The way you fooled German recon, that's legend now." Lang looked up from the prints. "Legend, Lieutenant, is just camouflage for the truth." The officer laughed awkwardly, unsure if it was a joke. Lang handed him a photograph, an aerial shot showing a cluster of tanks half buried in scrub. "Do you see them?" Lang asked. The officer squinted. "No, sir." "Good," Lang said softly. "That's how it should be." That spring he was sent north to advise on preparations for Operation Overlord. The challenge was new: Europe's forests and hedgerows, where shadow and green conspired differently than sand and glare. His job was to adapt desert camouflage to a continent of fog and foliage. He arrived at an assembly yard near Portsmouth, where dozens of Sherman tanks lined up like sleeping beasts under tarps. Engineers worked day and night, repainting their hulls with olive, black and brown disruptive schemes, the Lang pattern Type C. Standing beside the first completed vehicle, he felt a quiet pride. The colours were colder now, the shapes less jagged, the philosophy the same: break the outline, confuse the eye, steal the mind's certainty. An American officer nearby asked, "You really think this paint'll make a difference, Major?" Lang replied, "No paint ever won a battle, Captain. But sometimes it helps men live long enough to fight one." The officer nodded slowly. "Then here's to paint." On the morning of June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed Normandy, Lang watched from an observation post in southern England. Through field glasses, he saw the Armada stretching to the horizon, a living mosaic of grey, white and blue, all blended to vanish against sea and sky. Somewhere out there, under layers of camouflage and faith, were his ideas, fragments of his brushstroke carried across the channel. Every invisible tank, every unseen ship, every hidden gun emplacement whispered the same quiet triumph: they can't bomb what they can't see. For Lang, that was victory enough. The war dragged on, shifting from deserts to forests, from visibility to ruin. By the time Berlin fell, Lang's work had spread through every branch of Allied engineering. He received a modest commendation and a brief mention in dispatches. Nothing more. But among the soldiers, his reputation endured like rumour. They called him the man who made tanks disappear. After the war, Lang retired to a small house in Sussex, trading paint tins for garden soil. He rarely spoke of his work. Visitors found him quiet, almost invisible himself, often seen walking along the coast sketching clouds. Pip Wilkes visited once in 1948. They shared tea in the garden, reminiscing about the desert. When Pip left, Lang handed him a small notebook. "What's this, sir?" Pip asked. Lang smiled. "Every pattern I never got to finish." Inside were dozens of sketches, designs for snow camouflage, urban disruption, even patterns for ships and aircraft. Notes scrawled in the margins read, "Light bends, perception lies." Pip kept it until the day he died. Decades later, museum curators and military historians would rediscover Lang's experiments. Faded documents filed under Experimental Camouflage, Middle East Command. Few recognized the scope of what he'd done. His desert patterns had quietly influenced everything from NATO armour to modern stealth coatings. Visitors to the Imperial War Museum sometimes stop at a display of North African vehicles, Crusaders, Grants and Matildas painted in that strange, irregular pattern of sand and shadow. Most read the plaque, nod once, and move on. But for those who linger, for those who look closely, they can see it. The faint outlines of a mind that turned sunlight into illusion, paint into armour, and skepticism into salvation. And somewhere, beyond time and dunes, you can almost hear his voice again, calm, amused, utterly sure. They called it stupid, but it worked.